everybody, it is Wednesday here at the Northeast Georgia History Center. We've got a small but glorious crowd with us today. It's the middle of summer, and lots of people are trying to figure out what's going on with school. Will we be going? Will it be in person? Will it be virtual? There's no good answer. There's no 100% right answer, but we here at the History Center are going to continue to bombard you with as much important history as we can and probably scatter some non-important history too. Is there such a thing? Probably not. So it is August, and you know, back in my day, kids, if any of you younger people are listening, it's interesting because in Libba too, when we went to school didn't start until after like Labor Day. You know, we didn't go to school until the first part of September, and summers were longer. Again, it's probably because there's so much more history you need to learn that they need to add an entire month of school to cover that. What other things happen in August? Well, as a military historian, we're always going to go to what I know, and one of the most significant events of the 20th century happened in the first couple of weeks of August, August 6th and August 8th. Does anyone know what it was? I did say 20th century. That's a big hint. Let me give you another hint. Right? The exploding of the atomic bombs, the atomic weapons used on Japan during World War II, at Hiroshima first on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 8th. They effectively ended the war. They forced Japan to realize that there was no hope to carry on the war, that it would have been totally fruitless, and that hundreds of thousands of lives would be lost. And so those were the events that, in effect, led Japan to agree to an unconditional surrender. And eventually they did so about a month later on September 2nd, 1945, in Tokyo Bay on the USS Missouri. There was Douglas MacArthur and the High Command of the Pacific Theater, including not only Americans, but Australians, British, New Zealanders. There were some Dutch folks there. I think there was even a Russian, a Soviet there, because they had jumped right in and taken part in the war at about the last 3 days of it, so they could get a territory grab. Sorry, Soviet allies, but that's true. And that was the end of the war. But, you know, there's lots of issues that surround atomic weapons and the creation of them. And there's science, there's history, there's philosophy and morality. There's even a little bit of religion tied in there. And it's a fascinating story, the creation of the atomic bomb. And it really goes back, even though this was 1945, it goes back to the late 1800s when people were, you know, really starting to mess with atomic theory and the types of energies that could be released. And the problem is, this is all kind of, initially at least, theoretical physics. This is very smart guys on paper doing lots of equations, starting to figure out, well, an atom is this big, and the electrons move, and they probably put off this much energy, which is like infinitesimal. But when you have a lot of electrons and a large mass, and if you could somehow release the power of all those, you know, billions and trillions and gazillions of electrons all at once, that could put off a lot of energy. And of course, to give humanity credit, you know, the first thoughts was, well, what a fantastic energy source this could be, something we're still struggling with and trying to pursue today, a great source of energy. But also, like humanity, they began to realize there may be ways to weaponize this, to create something that could be so destructive and explosive that you would only need a couple of them to win a war, especially if you were the only ones with it. So scientists began to realize the potential of atomic weapons. Now, there were huge obstacles to overcome. There was not only the actual pure science and the calculations for it and the type of elements that you would want to use, there was the sheer physical capacity to create the fissible material, the nuclear material that would go into the bombs. How do you drop them? How heavy are they going to be? How do you force the masses together in such a way as to create an explosion rather than just a little radioactive fizzle? Lots of questions go into this, and it's a huge undertaking. And this really goes back to Albert Einstein writing a letter to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And in it, he says that there is, number one, a huge and dangerous potential for nuclear weapons. And number two, when me and my friends left Germany, we realized the Germans are working on this. This is something that the Germans, under the Nazis, are trying to develop nuclear weapons. And we didn't know how far they were in the science, in the technology. And so this letter to Roosevelt made the administration realize we need to start working on this too, because now there's a race for this super weapon, this ultimate weapon. We need to set this up. And if the Germans are going to get one, we need to get one first so that we can eliminate the threat and we can start to dictate terms. As it turns out, in hindsight, because that's what history is, the Germans never really got that close. They didn't. They knew the basic theories of how that could work, but they could never get the materials ready. They could never figure out all the technical problems that went along with creating a bomb out of something like this, a practical bomb. The Japanese also kind of dabbled with it, but the Japanese approach was literally not much more than a department of scientists working in a room on equations. That's about as far as the Japanese got, but we didn't know that either. In the United States, we undertook the hugest, is that a word? The most significant effort of the war, the Manhattan Project. And I know many of you have heard about that. And it was agreed with our closest ally, Britain. Britain knew that this was possible, but Britain was also much more of a backup against the wall situation than we were. And so as allies, we agreed, you know what? You focus your money, your talent, your productive capability on traditional war material, bombers, tanks, guns, things like that. Not only will we help with that, we'll be able to work on the systems to create atomic weapons. And they did. And they had to keep it under incredible secrecy. There were two main problems. What kind of radioactive, fissile material to use, and how to turn it into a weaponized bomb. You have to remember that scientists realized that they were going to need something like uranium and plutonium. And it's there on the periodic chart when you look at it. Sure, there's uranium, but the stuff was incredibly hard to get. It had to be manufactured and processed. It was not a naturally... The uranium-235 was not a naturally occurring element, right? They had to take uranium out of the earth. It's not lying about in your everyday gravel pit. Gather enough of it, process it, and create enough for a weapon. And so they set up a facility in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, way out in the sticks in the middle of nowhere. They bring hundreds, thousands of people in to work on producing the material for the bombs. And this was so secret that most people on the assembly line didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know what they were working on. They would go into work. They were told not to discuss this, even with your wives or your family or whatever. They would go into their place. There would be a little booth. And in this booth, like this is just an example, every 5 minutes there would be gauges. And when those gauges moved, they were supposed to record what those gauges said and then put them in a little hole in the wall, and someone would take them. They did this for like 2.5 years, not knowing what they were doing. And this was a huge production facility. It took up almost an entire town's worth of people to work on it. And in the end, what it created was about that much, right? It created about that much material, which should give you an idea of how difficult it is to create this. And they send this out to New Mexico, and there is a super secret site in the middle of the desert run by a guy named General Groves, who had just finished the Pentagon. He was the engineer in charge of building the Pentagon just as World War II started. He was put in charge of this aspect of the Manhattan Project. And he was the one who got all these scientists together. They built a little town in the middle of the desert, and these scientists worked for years trying to figure out the problems. And, you know, there's only enough material for one sample bomb and, you know, a couple of actual practical bombs. There's one type of bomb that they knew would work. I think it's plutonium. 2 masses of plutonium. They want to push them together really, really fast. That creates the explosion, the energy. And so they just kind of had to have a barrel of a gun to shoot one into the other. The math said this will work. We don't have to test this. We know it'll work. But the uranium bomb was a little different. They had to compress one core of uranium around a solid core of another one, like squeezing an orange. And so they had to create a type of explosive that would explode inward. That's why the bombs look the way they do. There's Fat Man and Little Boy. Maybe you may want to pull up pictures of Fat Man and Little Boy. Fat Man's this big, very roundish bomb because that's the implosion, the compression bomb. And then Little Boy is like the gun barrel with one piece of plutonium and the other piece of plutonium that just fires it together. And they develop these bombs. And, of course, they're at first overwhelmed by the science. They're kids in a candy store, right? Yeah, there we go. So Fat Man and Little Boy. And you can see there Hiroshima was Little Boy, the gun barrel approach, and then Nagasaki was the uranium-based bomb. And they were also just testing theories, right? Which is going to be the most effective, which is going to be the easiest to produce, because you're going to want more than one or two eventually. And like kids in a candy store, they're given every resource they can imagine to work on a fascinating science project. Well, as time goes by and they get closer, they begin to realize we're creating something that could literally be abused and end civilization as we know it. Should we keep going? What have we done? We know that, or we think, the Germans are working on these. Are we really going to be the good guys? Should something like this even be created? Should we go forward with it? Should we agree that we'll participate, but it has to be very, very limited? So the moral issues begin to kick in close to the end, and this is another huge discussion we won't get into, is today, looking back, was the United States justified in the necessity or the requirement of dropping atomic bombs on Japan? That is, again, we'll save that topic for another day because that's really complex. But this idea of atomic weapons and the development of the atomic bomb is a central part of the United States in World War II. And one of the most remarkable things is hardly anybody in the country knew it was going on until it went on. And then when it did become public, it's not like they said, we had an atomic bomb with uranium-235 and we compressed it in a core and it was great. They said, we have a new highly destructive weapon that's going to win the war for us with little loss of American lives. And that's it. That's all people needed to know, right? The smart ones who had kept an eye on the scientific journals probably guessed what it was, but most people are like, yay, a super weapon. We don't have to die. So that's the atomic bomb. I see we've got some more questions so that I don't have to continue to ramble about something that, of course, obviously I find quite fascinating. If you're interested in a book, it's called The Making of the Atomic Bomb, and I can't remember who the author is. Holmes?
Richard Rhodes.
Thank you, Richard Rhodes. The Making of the Atomic Bomb. It's a big old thick book, but it goes through a lot of detail from the very beginnings of the scientific developments, the on-paper developments, all the way through to the moral and military issues that had to do with the dropping of the bomb. So Niles asks, what information do we have on Georgia Unionists who resisted the Confederacy? I understand that opposition to secession tended to be stronger in the hill counties of North Georgia. Was there an active Unionist underground that engaged in sabotage in that region? Do we have a record of the number of white Georgians who served in the Union Army? That's a lot of questions. But yeah, so it's interesting. We think of the South as this monolithic thing, right? Going into the American Civil War. We're going to secede. We all have slaves. And we're going to fight against the Union for our liberty / the enslavement of other people, states' rights, lots of different things. Won't get into that now. But that's not the case. There were lots of places in the South that, even if they were not necessarily abolitionist, they certainly didn't believe in breaking the federal union. And, to use a faraway example, that's why today there's a West Virginia, right? Before the Civil War, there was not a West Virginia. It was all Virginia. And then when Virginia secedes from the Union and says, well, secession is our right, we're going to leave this Union, the western part of the state says, well, we don't want to leave the Union, we're seceding from you. And it's not like the rest of Virginia can say, hey, you can't do that. They had just justified it, so West Virginia leaves, rejoins the Union, and remains its own state today. North Georgia never seceded, but there are not necessarily abolitionist views in North Georgia, but there's certainly pro-union, anti-secession views. Why is this? Part of it is because there are not the large sprawling plantations in North Georgia. The geography and the topography do not lend themselves to large flat plantations with lots of cash crops like rice or indigo and, of course, cotton. So you don't have this large elite planter class in North Georgia that you have in other places, in the rest of the state along the coast and down along the Piedmont. You also have slave owners, but these are like poor yeoman farmers who either don't own slaves, they're just the regular farmer guys, or they might have 1 or 2 slaves that literally work in the fields side by side. They're basically hired hands that the people theoretically owned. So you don't have this, we've got to leave the Union to preserve our way of life. They're saying our way of life is fine. Why would we want to secede? When the state of Georgia has its secession convention in 1860, North Georgia, Northeast Georgia specifically, has about 40, I can't remember exactly, 40-something delegates, right, from this part of the state. All but 2 of those vote against secession. They vote to stay in the Union, almost as a one gigantic regional block. Now, the votes from around the rest of the state made the ordinance of secession move forward. We actually have a copy of that in the collections, I think. But there was not support. So when the war does start, the Confederacy is formed. There are people here who don't want to fight for the Confederacy. They certainly don't want to fight against the Union. And so some people sneak off, excuse me, to join the Union Army, especially the closer it gets, coming through Tennessee and into parts of North Georgia. There are people who just resist. They go hide up in the hills so they're not drafted into the Confederate Army. And this is one of the problems with Northeast Georgia, right? There's no armies that go through here of any size whatsoever. There are no major battles, and yet much of the area is laid waste. Why? Because of all this sort of internecine warfare between old Scotch-Irish people trying to settle scores, people trying to drag you into the Confederacy, people trying to force you to be loyal to the Union. Lots of things happen in Northeast Georgia, and there's another great book that I will recommend by a guy named Jonathan Sarris called A Separate Civil War. And if you want the best single book about what war was like, what the Civil War was like in this region, that's the one for you. It is a fantastic book. Were there any pro-Confederate people in the North, and did they enlist in the Confederate Army? Not nearly as many. I guess once secession happened and the Confederacy was formed, the sides were pretty much drawn. There were still some people in the North, especially from the officer corps, right? From the officer corps of the Army and the Navy, who decided to go with their state. Lots of military folks. But those were native Southerners. They weren't necessarily of the North who wanted to go south. There were a lot of regional and sectional differences between North and South in the time leading up to the Civil War. Differences on slavery, differences on economic systems, differences on, foreign trade. And quite frankly, a big part of being a Southerner was that you were not a Northerner, right? That you lived in the South. And it was the same for the North. So those sectional differences tended to solidify pretty strongly. And remember, those people in Northeast Georgia I was telling you were pro-Union, they weren't necessarily pro-North, right? They're just not wanting to leave the Union. They're still Southerners. They still believe in the South. They just don't believe in the Confederacy as a separate entity from the Constitutional Union. What was Magna Carta and why was it important? Magna Carta. So it's signed back in 1215, long ago. 250 years before the New World is even discovered. Long story short, in a nutshell, there is a King of England, and the King of England is trying to assert as much force over his country, over his nation, over his kingdom as he can. And of course, the people are trying to resist. Now, I don't mean the common people. I mean the barons and the dukes and the aristocrats, the ones who are sort of the high rank but not actually king. They're the ones who are trying to take power away from the king, basically so that they can control their lands and control their constituencies more closely without crown interference. And so there is a rebellion, and they rise up against King John. Now, King John was King Richard's brother. King Richard was a great warrior, not a very good administrator or leader as far as domestic issues go, but he was a great warrior, and no one would rise up against Richard when he was king. But when his brother John becomes king, John is considered somewhat of a weak king. He's not very powerful, so the barons see their chance. They rise up in a rebellion, and at Runnymede in 1215, they force him to sign this document called the Magna Carta. And the Magna Carta is seen as one of the seminal documents for the rights of British and for a more egalitarian society, perhaps even a proto-democratic society, but that's going too far, to be quite honest. The Magna Carta basically said things like the king's power is not absolute. The king must answer to Parliament. The king can spend taxes, but he cannot tell people to go and raise taxes. That has to be done through an assemblage of the lords. In other words, it's saying it's taxation with representation, right? It forbids the king from hiring foreign mercenaries to fight in England, because that's what John had been doing. It forbids him to just randomly go and take things from the common citizenry. In other words, the king can't be riding through and go, I want to bring that with me. Go steal that cart and horse from the peasant. It's mine now. It forbade things like that. So it really was about limiting the control of the king and putting more power in the hands not of the common people, but of the barons, of the aristocracy of England. Nevertheless, it did set up this idea that English monarchs are not absolute, and it created a much more, a constitutional monarchy, a way where at least a body of multiple people can act as a check against the king. And so Magna Carta is seen as the very progenitor of that in English tradition, government and legal tradition, which of course is American legal and governmental tradition. Can you speak about how the U.S. found and then conquered Hawaii, and why? Well, technically the U.S. didn't find Hawaii. That was something the British found, and then they put some flags up on it, and then the Spanish got a hold of it, and the United States didn't have it at first. But then we have this awesome thing called the Spanish-American War, and that sets America up to be a world empire. Before that, America was big, but it was the continental U.S., right, plus Alaska. But we didn't have an empire the way so many other European countries did. That was the grand game of the late 1800s and early 1900s, was to have an empire. The United States didn't have that until it went to war with Spain in 1898. And the Spanish-American War goes on, and that's the Rough Riders and, Cuba and the Philippines and things like that. Long story short, we forced Spain to sign a treaty ceding a lot of its possessions to us, including Cuba. Well, Cuba's independent, but we still have let's say we have a controlling interest. We get the Philippines, we get the Marshall, Gilbert Islands, Wake, Midway, lots of places like that. And Hawaii kind of comes along a little bit after that. And we want an empire, right? So we get Hawaii. It's the 50th, it's a territory at first, but then it eventually becomes the 50th state. And the reason we want it is partially to have an empire, and partially the same reason we want little bitty islands like Midway and Guam and Wake Island, places like that. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the way you became a world power was to have a fleet, a big naval fleet. And to have a big naval fleet, you had to have bases around the world. You could have the biggest fleet around, but if it's just limited to your coast, it's not really it's not an international world power fleet. You have to have stations to take on coal, to take on ammunition, all over the world. And so you have to have those bases to do it. And the Americas wanted to expand into the Pacific region, right? That was the untapped imperial part, which is why we got the Philippines and things like that. It's what made us butt up against the Japanese Empire and eventually led to World War II. But that's why we wanted Hawaii, mostly as a naval base and as a coaling station. And of course, it eventually does grow. It's still an important naval base today. And of course, it's so important that that's where the Japanese attacked on December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor.
And kind of related, we're wondering if you can talk about D-Day.
Oh, D-Day, yes. So I can talk a little bit about that. I think we've even done a couple of programs on those. You can go back. Okay, good. You can go back and watch those. But speaking of World War II and our efforts to try to free the world from totalitarianism, in Europe there was Germany, and Germany fought a war and lost. This war was called World War I. And the powers that won, the United States, Great Britain, and France, decided to punish Germany for what they had done in the war. And Germany said, oh, that's not fair. And then Germany ideologically fought back and rejected the terms of the treaty that came from World War I and started to build up their military again because they felt they had been wronged. Spoiler alert, they kind of had. That's a story for another day. But because they had been treated so badly, because their economy was so bad, because the national morale was so low, they were looking for someone who could give them a spirit. Unfortunately, that turned out to be Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, who said, I will provide jobs and I will make Germany great again. They did provide jobs. They did make Germany great again. But then they got Germany into an expansionist mood, and they wanted not just Germany to grow, but they wanted to conquer realms of Europe and the East, going up into Russia. And so this was sort of the plan all along. If you read Hitler's book, that's what it says. They want to expand into living space. And so when they invade Poland in 1939, they take a large part of it, and then Germany super expands. They conquer France. They go into Norway, Denmark. They go into Russia, and they have control of most of Europe by 1941, say. And then and after they invade Russia, they almost get to Moscow and almost take a lot of it. The United States gets involved, and the Allies realize Russia, Great Britain, United States, and France, what's left of France and other places, realize we've got to take out the Germans like where they're at in Europe. We can't just do it around the periphery, around the edges. We've got to strike into the heart of Europe, liberate it, and drive straight to Germany and defeat the Germans. That's easier said than done because you have to cross a lot of water to get there. The most obvious place is the English Channel, where the ocean is not too wide. It's very narrow. Germans knew it would come in that area. They didn't know exactly when, but the entire plan of the Allies to invade Europe and drive into the heart of Europe and Germany was known as Operation Overlord. And Operation Overlord was the most complex amphibious assault that has ever been planned or taken place in all of human history. And they had to have the right kind of landing craft. They had to have aerial bombardments for months to prepare for it. They had to train the men. All these different things. This was going to be one of America's main efforts in the war, because once you get into Europe, you're going to have to keep pouring men and weapons into it to keep your army growing and growing and growing. When Operation Overlord was set to go, they finally picked a day, and that day was to be D-Day. Now, what does D-Day mean? It doesn't really mean anything. That was sort of just the plan called for D-Day H-hour. So D-Day is the day when the attack's going to take place. H-hour is the hour of the day, and that name just sort of stuck because this was the biggest one. This is where the name D-Day stuck. But in the parlance of the time when they're going through planning amphibious operations in other places, including the Pacific, they still use the term D-Day H-hour. But to us today, looking back on the largest amphibious operation, we call that day, June 6, 1944, D-Day. Let's see. And you're a graduate student. Goodness, that's impressive. In my graduate school course on early medieval English history, my professor maintained that John was an effective administrator but not a good military leader, to the opposite of Richard. In light of this, why do you think John is commonly depicted as the villain in Robin Hood legends? 2 words: bad publicity. I mean, honestly, they were because he was especially compared to his brother. Can you imagine? Those of you who have older siblings, you know what it's like to live under the shadow of the older sibling. So many times people are like, oh, why can't you be more like him or her? And they were so good and you're not. And his whole life, people are like this. And then when he becomes king, Richard has left the country in a pretty poor state. And John does a pretty good job administratively of getting things together. But he's not Richard. He's not a manly man. He's not going out there on the battlefield. And because he was having to fix a lot of the financial problems that Richard had created in England, he and his, I keep saying administration. It's not an administration. His kingdom does not have a lot of money. And so he's called John Lackland because he's having to dole out all of his lands to supporters to support him. Turns out it didn't work because he still had to sign Magna Carta and things like that. But it's really just because the people at the time began to call him names, and the chroniclers of the time left very unflattering descriptions of him personally and how he did things. He was not a popular king. Because of that, this legend has sort of built on top of John. Well, we need a bad English king to write a story around. I know. How about King John? He was kind of a dweeb. And, that couples in with the whole Robin Hood legend. It's a very popular time to base things in English literature. Look at Ivanhoe. If any of you have read Ivanhoe or seen any of the movies or miniseries about that, it's set in the exact same time period, and Robin Hood shows up and things like that. There was a great movie that recently came out. I say recently, in the last 10 years. Oh no, I've forgotten what the name of it was. I'm just going to stare at the screen until I think of it. It's about Prince John laying siege to a castle, and it's got some really good. John Purefoy is like one of the main actors, but it depicts Prince John sort of as this. It's Paul Giamatti. That's his name. Paul Giamatti plays Prince John, or actually at this point King John, and does a fantastic job of kind of making him this over-the-top, overbearing, talks really loud but doesn't really got a lot of stuff done, is not an admirable character. Ironclad, thank you. It's called Ironclad. So we're still making movies depicting John as the bad guy. Again, if you need a bad king of England to set a story around, Prince John is your go-to. And it's because the chroniclers of the time and the stories that came out about him from a contemporary standpoint are incredibly unflattering and disrespectful. And it's hard to get over bad publicity when you initially get some. That's for sure.
Why didn't Germany collapse during the Great Depression?
Why didn't Germany collapse during the Great Depression? Oh, it did. It had sort of already collapsed in a way. So World War I happens. So complicated. Germany loses. Germany has to sign the Treaty of Versailles, which says, among other things, this was all Germany's fault. Germany is bad, and Germany has to pay the Allies for all the expenses of the war, including the war dead, all the money we spent on the war. We have to pay back our loans. Germany is going to pay that back to the Allies. As you can imagine, this is a huge sum. And Germany has no choice because its armies have fallen apart, its government has fallen apart, and it sort of has to go along with it for a while. So through the 1920s, Germany is not doing that well financially anyway. The Weimar Republic, which is its form of government, is just barely held together. It's not doing well financially. There's lots of unemployment. And, okay, this is so complicated. Let me see if I can sum it up. During World War I, the United States had loaned a lot of money to Great Britain and France to finance the war. That's why Britain and France wanted Germany to pay them the money back, so that they could then pay the United States back for all the loans. After the war, that's sort of what the entire European economy was built on, was having Germany pay Britain and France money so that Britain and France could repay their loans to the United States. Germany can't pay. If Germany can't pay, the Great Britain and France default on all their loans, their economy tanks, and it's not very good for anyone. So, you ready? The United States loans money to Germany so that Germany can pay the reparations to Britain and France so that Britain and France can pay the money back to the United States. Did you follow? It creates this weird triangular mess, right? And so when the Great Depression happens, again, that's an incredibly simplistic view, but when it happens, the American economy collapses, and it follows on that a lot of the European economy goes down. And things in Germany had already been kind of bad, but it just kept they were already so low that when the Depression happened, they, instead of going like this, they just kind of went like this, right? Does that make sense? So, because they were already pretty low. And, all that bad ill will, all that economic problems, that's when your megalomaniacal people pop up, folks. That's how the Nazis got into party, is because they promised things people needed. And they delivered, mostly. They delivered. They gave jobs. They created food surpluses. They created civic organizations that people could take pride in being Germans. And now, the people at the top are bent on conquest and genocide, but that's for later. Right now, in the early 1930s, they're the ones who start fixing things. So there's your lesson from history. It's not necessarily that madmen take over. It's that situations arise in a country where people are looking for answers, and they're looking for anything that can help. And those who can provide the answers and the help are the ones that people are going to turn to, unfortunately. All right. So can you talk about early history of Los Angeles? Who were the first people to settle there? Why did they go there? I'm going to be honest. I am not very good at Los Angeles history. I'm a Southern boy, a Georgia historian. I cannot tell you. So congratulations. Bing! You have stumped Glenn. Well done. Let's see. In your assessment, did Jefferson Davis do the best job he could under the circumstances as Confederate president in spite of the many mistakes he made? Let me give a mushy historian answer. Yes and no. He was saddled with a nearly unprecedented challenge when he was made president of the Confederacy. Even when Washington became president, the war was over. He was the first president. He had a lot of precedents he had to set. He had to set the new nation on a course, but the war was over. When Jefferson Davis comes into power as the president of the Confederacy, the Confederacy is going to be at war in a couple of weeks. And he suddenly has to not only create a national government from scratch and become the leader and set all these policies, he has got to organize the resources of an entirely new nation and get them going in a way that is meaningful enough so that they can defend themselves and preserve their liberty. That's not just resources and armies. That's foreign policy. That's diplomats. That's feeding the people. That's making sure you get elected next time. It's working with a legislature that's full of cantankerous people who can't agree on anything. So, on one hand, yes, Jefferson Davis did do, I think, one of the best things that he could, given he's a very talented man. He was very highly thought of. He wouldn't have been elected president. The mistakes he made were not malicious. They were not based on ignorance or stupidity. I think, if anything, they were based on, if you'll excuse the metaphor, nearsightedness. He was in Richmond, Virginia during the war. The people of Richmond, Virginia are the ones he had the most direct contact with. The armies and the battles closest to Richmond, Virginia are the ones that consumed most of his attention, most of his time, and most of his concern. As a result, lots of things that were happening outside of Richmond and outside of Virginia that happened in the West, in Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, he's not paying as much attention to. He's not saying, well, they have a lot more territory to defend, therefore they need more men, they need more resources, they need more supplies. Let's listen to them and see how we can do that. He kind of gave the Western theater some stuff, but he's so focused on the Eastern theater and making sure that Richmond and Virginia doesn't fall to the Union that he kind of forgets the other parts of the war, much to the detriment of the Confederacy. The Western battles take a lot more men. They cover a lot more space. They require a lot more transportation and supplies, and they just don't get it. From the North either, for that matter, Lincoln, and I should say that fault of Jefferson Davis's for the early part of the war is also a fault of Lincoln until he starts to realize the grander strategic scope of what the United States is capable of because of its overwhelming resources and manpower, then things from the Union perspective start to shift in the West in a way that they never really shift in the Confederacy. In a nutshell. Oh, can you tell us about General Patton? Yes, a little bit. So, Patton has come down to us as one of the most famous and well-recognized names of United States generals in World War II. He was the, I'm trying to think, I believe he was the son of a Confederate soldier, maybe the grandson. He had a long, distinguished military lineage, and from the time he was a boy, he wanted to continue that family tradition of being a military man, went to West Point, and felt that he was destined for some great thing. He's an interesting person. He believes, to a certain extent, in reincarnation. He's a devout Christian, but he also believes in reincarnation. And he believes that he is several of the greatest generals in history reincarnated, or at least the soldiers from different time periods, from ancient Rome all the way through the Civil War to the present day of World War II. He fought in World War I. I believe he was a battalion commander in World War I and was a cavalryman. He was always a cavalryman, even in World War II, commanding tanks. He thought like a cavalryman, sweeping flank moves and fast charges to break the enemy, things like that. Works for horses, works for tanks, and that's always how he thought. But in World War I, he was brave and brash to the point of idiocy. There's a great story of him and Douglas MacArthur when the United States Army had finally gotten into France, and there was MacArthur and Patton with their men in a trench, and they were sort of walking up and down the trench line checking on their men, and artillery starts to fall, right? All around the United States soldiers. And the men are just hunkered in the trenches, and they look up, and there stand Patton and MacArthur. And they're just standing there because neither one of them is going to be the first person to jump in the trench. They're waiting for the other person to jump in so that they're the last in. Neither one of them jump in. So over this entire artillery barrage, there are Patton and MacArthur just sort of strutting around in their uniforms while the shells are just flying everywhere. Gives you a good insight into what he thought. He was obsessed with winning. He was obsessed with the fact that his strategies, his tactics, the way he saw the war was the most right, was the most proper, and was going to be the most effective in terms of securing victory. That made him a lot of enemies. He said what he thought. He was rough on the men that he did not think tried hard enough. He was incredibly full of praise for the men who he did think tried hard enough. And because of a lot of his just get stuff done attitude, he like I said, he made a lot of enemies. He was not very political, and political is not the word I mean. He's not very diplomatic. He's not easygoing. If he says something, he says it to someone. He says whatever he thinks. He doesn't try to sugarcoat it. By the end of the war, he had done so many bad things, and not bad things. He'd slapped a couple of soldiers. He had called them cowards. He had disobeyed some direct orders because he thought he knew best. And by the end of the war, they take away his military command, and he's just sort of languishing in Germany. And he is actually, his neck is broken, his spine is broken in a car accident going from one command post to the other. This is after the war is over, right? The war is done. Germany has surrendered. The American forces are occupying, trying to keep the peace and prepare for the winter of 45-46. His spinal column is broken in a car accident, and he languishes for several days in pain. They have to put him in traction, and eventually he dies from that wound. How awful is it that someone who has gone through two world wars and is a brash commander and wants to die gloriously in battle, he dies in a hospital bed from a car wreck. It's kind of sad, and it's certainly not what he, I'm sure, wanted. But he was from a purely military perspective, he was a genius. But when you get to the level that Patton was commanding troops, it requires more talents than just pure military genius. It requires a lot of different nuanced approaches to getting things done. Are there any events in USA history that involved hot air balloons? Let's see. In the United States, I believe a Frenchman launched a hot air balloon. 19th September 1783. Thank you. So the French were the first to create hot air balloons, and the science was very, very basic. As a matter of fact, at first, they didn't think it was hot air. They thought it was the smoke, which of course is hot air, but it was the smoke that went up in and made things float. And so the French were really the first, the aerostatic aircraft that could float up into the air, of course, totally uncontrolled, and then float along. So this was the first time people were able to fly, that mankind could fly. That was the only aeronautical technology that existed for a while, up to and including, for example, the American Civil War. In the American Civil War, there was a balloon corps, both in the Union certainly, and in the South there was a little bit of it. And I wish I could tell you that they sent up balloons and they had gigantic sky battles with thousands of balloons, but that's not the case, although that would make a really cool short movie. For any of you movie makers out there, you should do that for me. But they would use the balloons. They would tie the balloons down, and they would go way up in the air, and then guys would go up with binoculars and sometimes even pencil and paper, and they would sketch the enemy positions, what the fortifications looked like, how many men they thought there might be there, and then they would go back down and send that intelligence and report it to the general. Well, the problem with that is, of course, when a hot air balloon goes up in the air, how big a target do you think that is? So there's sharpshooters are going to be shooting at those. Artillery is going to be shooting at those. And so it was kind of dangerous being in the balloon corps, and it wasn't incredibly widely common. But they did, especially the Union, did use them through the war. But, that's, again, with my limited knowledge, that's about the most I can say about the role of the hot air balloon in American history. I do know that near here in Helen, Georgia, every year there is a huge hot air balloon extravaganza that takes place. 5 will get you 10 that it's been canceled for this year. But normally, like I said, look that up. In Helen, Georgia, there's a big balloon fest, and there are hundreds of these beautiful supercolor balloons that take off and just float through the mountains. It's a really neat thing to see. Okay, there's 2. I know I'll see. I can get those 2 certainly. Can you talk about the Night Witches of World War II? A little bit. So, in Night Witches in World War II were some Soviet pilots, and from the name you may surmise that they were actually female. So there was a unit of women, because the Soviets are looking to employ every resource they have, and that includes women in combat, not only in some sniper and infantry roles, but also piloting aircraft as well. And so they didn't give them the absolute best airplanes, right? They gave them some of these old biplanes, but they were incredibly brave, and so they wouldn't send them up in the daytime because they would get slaughtered, right? They would definitely get slaughtered, but they would send them up at night to bomb and strafe where the enemy positions were. And the Germans are actually the ones that gave them the term Night Witches because, again, these are big biplanes. So unlike the more advanced fighter aircraft at the time, you can take them up, cut the engines out, and you can coast those things. So it literally is just a as the airplane goes, right? So these witches would kind of get a sense of where the Germans were during the daytime, and then when it got dark, they would take their plane up, they would get it into position, cut the engines, and then swoop down silently so they didn't draw any aircraft fire, and then they'd cut the engines back on, they'd drop all the bombs they could, and use all the machine guns they could and get out of there. So you can imagine being a German sitting there, you're just minding your own business, invading the Soviet Union, eating a can of beans, and all of a sudden, explosions start happening, machine guns start hitting your camp, and you hear a airplane engine start up and take off in that direction. And this happens all night long, which means you don't get to sleep very much, and that makes you very tired the next day and not as effective a soldier. So, that's in a nutshell what the Night Witches were. They were really, really fascinating. They've got a really neat story, and many of them were decorated with a lot of awards. I believe one or two of them actually got Hero of the Soviet Union, which is the highest award that the Soviet Union can award. Where did tar and feathering come from? We know what happened during the American Revolution, but was it already a practice elsewhere? I think it was a practice, certainly in Great Britain. I believe to a certain extent in France, but I know it was in Great Britain. It's sort of a people's movement, egalitarian thing, right? That's how you punish folks, and it's sort of entered modern parlance. Oh, they should be tarred and feathered. You would take hot tar that they would work on ships with, put that on a human body, and then maybe pour some feathers on it because it looked silly. Ha ha, hilarious. Problem is that when you start looking at the actual act of and outcomes from tarring and feathering, it's quite horrific. Maybe some of you have been driving along a road and you've seen them putting asphalt down, right? And it smells, and it's incredible. I mean, it's kind of melted rock, right? And so when you have this melted stuff, you're going to tar and feather someone, you want to send a message. It's a political message. It's a social statement. So when you take tar and pour it over their skin, that's immediately going to be second or third degree burns that occur wherever that tar touches you. They strip you naked, first of all, which is pretty humiliating. Then they put tar on you, and probably in very certain places, it burns like crazy. Second and third degree burns, incredibly painful. And then they're going to put feathers in it to not only look funny, but you're going to have to clean all this off eventually because it's like a road, it's going to dry. How do you get tar that's dried onto your skin off? You have to scrub it. So you're basically having to peel and scrub something off of a second or third degree burn. Again, excruciatingly painful. Many people who were tarred and feathered, or even just tarred, ended up dying in the process because even if they survived scraping off the burned parts of their skin, they have no protection there, and infection could very, very easily set in, and they would die. So tarring and feathering was a horrific punishment and was kept in reserve for something that people felt very strongly about. It was, if I'm remembering correctly, it's not like it was a formal punishment that was carried out by a municipality or a state. It's always a mob action. It's a mob rule thing where they find there's that guy, get him. He's a tax collector / he's someone we don't like, and they do this to them. And it, like I said, it's absolutely horrific. So when you kind of look up on that, there's a great when they talk about tarring and feathering in school books, there's always this one picture they show of a guy who has feathers all over him, and he's down on his knees, and Massachusetts men are smiling as they pour tea down into his mouth. That's the one they always show. And it looks funny. It looks like they're pouring tea into a kneeling Sasquatch or a abominable snowman, but whoa, an awful thing, an absolutely awful thing.
I know you got to run right to after this, or do you have time for one more question?
I've got time for one more question.
Okay,
I got time for one more question.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. So Josh asks, let's see, why was John J. Pershing's rank General of the Armies?
Okay, that's a good question. I appreciate all the military history questions, guys. It really helps me seem like I know what I'm talking about. And we've had a lot of World War I today. I like that. So World War I starts in 1914. United States remains neutral until 1917, when it is forced to intervene for a couple of different reasons, the most important of which is because of unrestricted submarine warfare on the high seas from the Germans. And as President Wilson says, it's America's role to keep the world safe for democracy. This is a struggle, as he puts it, of civilizations, and the survival of the Western culture and ideals are at stake. So again, they fight the war for 2.5 years before America gets involved, and it takes America a while to get enough men drafted, put into the armies, trained, equipped, and taken 3,000 miles across the ocean, trained a little bit more, and then put into the front line. So even though we declare war in 1917, we don't really get soldiers in place in any meaningful numbers until summer of 1918. But the commander of the American Expeditionary Force is is John Pershing. He had been a commander of African-American troops in the Spanish-American War, and especially the Philippine insurrection. He had been in charge of the punitive expedition along the Texas border when the U.S. Army went into Mexico to punish them for Pancho Villa's incursions into Texas. And so he was the man with the most experience, and Patton and MacArthur both looked up to him fantastically. And so for America's efforts in World War I, he was the guy. He was the one who said, you know, we're going to get all of our forces over here, and then we're going to fight as the American army, that we're going to be a part of the Allies, but we're not going to send our troops here and there. We're going to wait until we get a critical mass and go on the attack, and by golly, we're going to win. Now, does World War I end in Allied victory only a couple of months after America gets all its troops in place? Yes. Is that because American troops turned the tide and won the war because Europeans didn't know what they were doing? No. But that's, of course, what Americans think, because that's what American publicity says. So Pershing goes, this war drags on for years. Pershing and the doughboys go over. War's over. Victory. The boys come home, and their succeeding commanding general is the greatest hero of the age. And so the Congress wanted to come up with a rank that befitted this greatest American soldier in the greatest war in the world. And so the one they came up with was General of the Armies. You know, this is higher than a lieutenant general is a 4-star rank, which is what he had held in Europe. But then they made him General of the Armies. And the only person, and actually, of course, that's a higher rank than George Washington. So what they had to do to make sure George Washington was still soldier number one in all of our history is they posthumously promoted Washington to General of the Armies of the United States. And then the next day, they promoted Pershing to General of the Armies. That way, Washington outranked him because of seniority, right, by one day. But then Pershing was the next man in line for that rank. So he was the highest-ranking living person who ever achieved that rank in the United States. Oh, I think that's all the time we have here at the Northeast Georgia History Center in the Cottrell Digital Studio. We're so glad to have had you join us on this Wednesday. Keep those questions coming. Keep watching our digital broadcast. If you're not already a member, please consider doing that. It's only $3 a month or $35 a year for exclusive members content, including some members content coming up this Friday. And I think we're going to start, 1920s dancing. And, we're going to be working, as school gets closer, we're going to be working on some special members content, too, that's going to make a difference. But we'll still be doing all the regular stuff. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for being a fan of the History Center. And until we see you next time, stay safe and take care.